I'm talking to you all today as a reader. I am a reader, yes I'm a critic, yes I'm a translator, but basically I am someone who lives to read, to figure out what to read, and to figure out how to share my enthusiasms with people who I think should read the things I like. Part of that group of people creates in the flesh in 3D the reason for the existence of things like La Pléiade and Library of America. I've got a book group of 18 women, and 6 of them are either French or have French husbands. And so we meet in the flesh, and I have been raiding the titles of Library of America to find things that I know that they ought to read and that I hope they will enjoy. And in the last year, we've done short stories of Edith Wharton from the Library of America collection. We've done Cheever stories, and we've done recently Elmore Leonard. And I hadn't realized that he was to be considered literary. I didn't know that Martin Amis said that inasmuch as America had a national author, it was Elmore Leonard. And my God, we found out why reading him. And also we met in one of our members' houses, and she serves salty dogs, which is a drink that features in several of these Elmore Leonard gripping stories. So my thought is always about how to make books matter to my life and how to make the reading of the books continue to feel like a vital thing for our countrymen and for Frenchmen and for people around the world. I was going to tell you today a little bit about why I care about French literature as well as American literature. Unlike many of you here, I imagine, I'm not an East Coaster, I'm from the Midwest. I grew up in college towns in Michigan, Indiana, and Oklahoma. But I come really from farm stock in Illinois. My grandparents lived in Springfield, Illinois, which is where Lincoln lived for a time. And whenever, as a child, I would go with my parents to Springfield and visit the grandparents, we would go and visit the Lincoln house in the center of town. And my mother was quite fanatically passionate about the American Civil War and the writing attached to that. And I remember her reciting to me, with tears in her eyes, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," the Walt Whitman poem, when we were in the Lincoln Museum. And when I went down to the gift shop, I got a copy written on fake parchment of his Gettysburg address. And so just really from my earliest days, I was infused by my mother, with a sense of wonder toward the power of American eloquence in particular, what words could do, but also the eloquent history of our country and of its literature. But this wonderment I had in American literature didn't just stop at our borders. In 1981, those grandparents of mine in Springfield took me to France and visited with me a war cemetery in Arromanches in Normandy. It was 1981, I was 14, and I didn't have much of a consciousness of what Americans' involvement had been with France during the Second World War at the time. But my great uncle Denis, who was a farm boy from Illinois, had died in Normandy Beach on the day of the invasion. And so I came back to New York. I said Indiana, sorry. Just sort of understanding that strange connection. And many years later, on the 50th anniversary of D-Day in June of 1994, I wrote an essay for the Washington Post about realizing the significance of that day. And I wrote about how I looked at those rows of crosses and seen how necessary it was to remember those who came before us. And I wrote, "The only vault where anyone or anything truly lives is in the mind that remembers." And being with you here today, talking about these two great literary institutions, it seems to me that literature is that vault for the remembering mind. The literature of France, of America, of England. It is in these books that a nation's character and soul and important doings are preserved. And so when I think of the Library of America, in some ways I think of the life of America. And the Pléiade, I've been informed, is not only French, but the lives of the world are being kept alive in these pages by those who read and who care about what they read. So now, though, I'm now I'm a veteran New Yorker, and I mostly read contemporary fiction, day in, day out, 3 or 4 books a week. And I inflict on my book club the books that I decide really matter, and sometimes they agree with me, and sometimes they're tearing their hair out and scolding me. I love Knausgaard, all 3 volumes. I can't wait for the next 3. Not everyone feels the same way. But so, when I go to my bookshelves, I can pull down now that volume of Whitman that I knew a poem or 2 of when I was little. I can pull down Lincoln's speeches, not just Gettysburg and his other writings. Thomas Jefferson, Thoreau, and then Edith Wharton, Cheever, Susan Sontag. And also as a Midwesterner, I'm especially fond of the writing of Kurt Vonnegut. I consider myself a Hoosier. He would call that a grandfalloon, which is a fake sense of connection to people who are in your group but aren't really connected to you. And then, of course, recently, I've loved Elmer Leonard. But, I'm also a Francophile, like that other Library of America and Pléiade author, Henry James. And that's because my grandparents didn't take me to France just on a lark in 1981. It was reward because my ambitious, odd parents had forced Purdue University to let me study French as a little girl in the college from the ages of 10 to 14. And having completed those 4 years was my reward that my grandparents gave me. And, so by the age of 14, I could read in French and in English. But my love of books really didn't only come from French literature. It came from my mother's imposition on me of a reading list. From the age of 5 to 15, before I finally abandoned it, or she abandoned it, or I chose my own books, I did sneak all of her John Irvings and Updikes and all the things that Tom Robbins. But so I had a reading list of a classic book a week. They were English, they were British, they were American, they were French and German and Russian in translation, and I read them. I regarded it as a challenge. And so when my nephews, who are 8 and 10, were asking me last week, Aunt Liesl, what should we read? And they're reading things that I regard as illiterate, which makes me really sad. I actually started giving them a list of all the ones I loved, and they were down with Mark Twain and Jack London, but they refused to read Louisa May Alcott. I hope that I can change their minds one day. But I actually went onto Facebook and crowdsourced my friends who have sons and got a list of 70 titles that their children are passionate about. Now, I haven't read them, and so it was a huge misgiving that I alphabetized the list and wove them into the classics and sent them to my nephews. But I looked on Amazon, they're very highly rated. And maybe in 50 years, these will be children's classic literature. It doesn't pay to be too prejudiced or too scornful, because there's every kind of reader in the world. There's every kind of book has a reader. We can say that some books are better than others, but we first have to get people to read the books. And then I hadn't known that the miraculous Paul Auster was going to talk about Poe, so I just did have a final little wrapping thought of what brought these 2 collections together for me in my head. And that's that when I was a kid in Indiana, my mother loved to read stirring poetry to us on winter evenings or whenever she could catch our attention. And she would read Poe, The Raven and the Bells, and it was kind of electrifying to listen to her read him. But it wasn't until college, my freshman year of college, when I was taking a seditious course called La littérature et le mal, Literature and Evil, that I discovered Baudelaire. And was fascinated in that class to realize how much Baudelaire cared about Poe, how much those internal rhymes mattered to him. And of course, you could then see Poe-like resonance. Well, I don't mean to suggest that Baudelaire was copying Poe. You would know if he was or wasn't. But it was very exciting to trace that line of admiration across the Atlantic. I found it very inspiring. And it interested me recently to discover that Baudelaire was published in the very first year that La Pléiade was publishing its books. In 1931, they did a volume of Baudelaire. But in 1932, they did a volume of Poe. And that shows that these literatures have been operating with knowledge of each other and appreciation of each other since the beginning. And then my final thought on that is that freshman course I took on Baudelaire and evil French literature turned into my senior thesis. And I wrote about Baudelaire's idea of the representation of the present. And what that idea meant was that in his mind, there really wasn't such a thing as the present. What there was a hinge connecting the past and the future. And the only way for any of us to gain a hold of a sense of what the present meant when it was flourishing, when it was alive, was to read it or see it in the work of some great artist who knew how to trap it, to convey it, to give the truth of that writer's present, of its reality. And so that's the great gift of these two national libraries that we've been talking about today. They preserve for us these hinges in time. They make those lives and ideas present for all of us. Thank you.